We have known ourselves to not have chosen who we are. This is not a lifestyle choice. It is something that we were born into. Our created reality is of utmost importance because we are not human outside of our bodies. In the early Christian Greco-Roman world, where were the LGBT people? They existed. It was part of normal society. Our physical bodies mean something, even in an eternal sense, which includes our sexual orientations. What was Paul railing against? It was the exploitation of sexual relationships. Even my gayness is being redeemed by Jesus Christ. I think that it's problematic just to lump a Christian worldview with a particular political party. Maybe you should deny your straightness and become celibate.
I'd say an issue that's defining traditional Christianity today, like the Lutheran Church, especially the Episcopal Church, I know like United Methodists too, and Presbyterians, like a big issue defining all of mainline Protestantism today is LGBTQ inclusion. And for Episcopalians, that kind of started with the organization of like Gene Robinson. I mean, obviously it kind of goes like further back, but that was like the real like breaking point for a lot of Episcopalians. And the conservative Episcopalians, they left and they created the ACNA, and well, I mean the Episcopals stayed. Why do you think that specifically has become such a divisive issue in the Episcopal Church?
If you back it up a little farther, the first mention of LGBT folks in any of the records of the official records of the church was 50 years ago in the 70s. At which at the same time, the Episcopal Church was ordaining women, which was also a very divisive moment in the church, in which many Episcopalians left the church and became a various kind of Episcopal church or Anglican church. There were other issues like prayer book. That was a huge issue in the Episcopal Church in the 70s, going into the 80s, as to what are the traditions of this church and how do we define who we are. But especially, I think, in the ordination of women, and then the subsequent ordination of LGBT folks, is what is the notion of right and wrong in sexuality and gender. That obviously has manifested in a schism of probably most of the mainline churches, is coming down on one side or the other. I will speak from my own experience, and those of a lot of LGBT folks, is that we have known ourselves to not have chosen who we are. This is not a lifestyle choice. It is something that we were born into. The same as your eye color or your skin color, that our sexuality and our gender is something that we are born into. But those things are not just defined necessarily by kind of a popular worldview, but that those have fallen outside of what have been traditional norms. Despite, from my own experience, despite trying very desperately for many years of trying to choose what my conservative evangelical upbringing told me that I needed to be. I needed to conform to this. It manifested in depression and a self-loathing and a poor understanding of who I was, because I didn't choose these things. I never chose that, and if I didn't choose it, then that means God created me that way. And if God created me as a gay person, is that God condemning me from no choice of my own? If you go back to John Calvin, he may have something to say about that. I think that that sense that God has created some people for damnation as being an abominable heresy. Since I did not choose to be a gay person, and God created me to be this way, then the sense of my own salvation stems on me embracing the fullness of who God created me to be. And that includes, obviously, the grace of Christ, but also that God created us individually to fulfill his own goodwill and wishes upon the world and his own creation. That's evident in his being the creator. And then God creates all things good. Mm-hmm. Coming back to the mainline churches especially, and I would say not just mainline churches, all of the church experiences LGBT people,
right?
Because we have existed forever. Mm-hmm. We didn't just pop into existence in the last 50 years. Mm-hmm. There have always been gay people. Right. There's always been transgender people, and so another way of looking at that is like, why has this kind of purity culture, this purity understanding of sexuality, mm-hmm. Come to a head? And the question is, was it always a fact? Mm-hmm. Or is that more of a modern understanding mm-hmm. of sexuality purity culture? Whereas if we go back even like before the Reformation, there is some evidence that this has been an ongoing development of our understanding of what gender norms are and what sexual norms are. Mm-hmm. In contexts and cultures that are quite different from in which we live now. Mm-hmm. We come with a lot of assumptions about what was right and wrong, what was considered right and wrong, what was considered normative, even under gender roles, in sexual relationships, that the church honestly kind of went very much against. Look at the celibacy of the priesthood. If marriage and family were the ultimate normative goal, why require priests to be celibate? Mm-hmm. So there's this kind of strange, there's a strangeness if you go back and look at even Roman culture was in the early Christian Greco-Roman world. Where were the LGBT people? Mm-hmm. They existed,
right?
And they were just it was part of normal society. Mm-hmm. And when we see that expressed in the scriptures, it's within that context, especially in the New Testament. What was Paul railing against? It was the exploitation of sexual relationships, mm-hmm. especially in a form of Roman aristocracy, in which you would have a protege come under someone of power, and how that dynamic was sexually exploitative against the protege. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is more what Paul is talking about in Romans especially. But if just looking back through time, there is an evolution of thought and culture that is often forgotten about. And from our modern perspective, we just kind of look back and assume that Christians have always thought the same way, have always been from the same culture, have always had the same worldview mm-hmm. about these things. And this is not true. Mm-hmm. And so what we're experiencing now in these kind of culture wars within the church, that this is just a modern manifestation of the sense of reality and sense of propriety and right and wrong, and who is worthy and who is not. That is a manifestation of our modern church, not necessarily one of historic Christianity.
Mm-hmm. I think because we're definitely going to get into the whole like denominational split in a second. We'll tie back to that in a second. But one thing I want to ask, because I feel like a lot of evangelicals would make this point as well. One of the things you said was about embracing yourself as part of being a Christian, embracing who God made you to be. And I think a lot of evangelicals would push the question, what makes you believe that you were created gay and it wasn't like a choice? I think a lot of people would compare being homosexual to, let's say, like lust or like another like sin that God like created you to struggle with, maybe, that you're predisposed to.
Sure.
But it's not an identity to be proud of, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah.
Like it's another sin to be wrestled with, but it's not something that you embrace. You don't embrace lust, like you don't embrace that.
Right.
It's a challenge that some of us are given more than others. So why is being homosexual not one of those kind of types of sins? Why is it in an identity? Why is it something that God created you to?
Right. And
embrace?
I think that you already kind of named it, but you've kind of danced around. And I think these are kind of conflated. So, I mean, gay people are also susceptible to lust, and maybe even famously so. I think that's a manifestation of kind of the liberation movement and public celebration of and those are not all good things. I mean, I think that there's some unhealth in that as well. But that you need to separate what are actions of sin and then what is identity. A sexual orientation is not an action. It is an orientation in which, I mean, before I came out and before I was married, I was celibate. I was a virgin. I was not promiscuous, but I perceived this to be a sin because of the upbringing that I was brought in. But I knew that I had not acted that way. I had lustful thoughts, and I struggled with pornography for a while, which is fairly common. But I think that the orientation itself was not something that I chose, and it is something I tried to change. I tried to choose otherwise, and could not. That's part of who I am. And coming to that realization and parsing those two things out is critical to understand in LGBT people and in transgender folks. That the sense of identity, the sense of who am I, living in this body and in relationship to other people, and there's a sexual reality to that. Who am I attracted to? Just as straight people are naturally attracted to opposite gender, even a sense of your own gender. I think that's an understanding of within yourself that those of us who are cisgender, not transgender, have a sense that I match with that. Whereas there might be some dysmorphia of those who do not have that sense of their own self. And so it comes back around to, in the former part of our conversation, is what is our own reasoning? What is our own reasoning, our own sense of who we are as a human being that has to be reckoned with in the sense of faith? It's like, I don't live in an unembodied reality. And I think that, coming back to the incarnation, is our created reality is of utmost importance, because we are not human outside of our bodies. And that is why the resurrection is so critically important to understand as part of the Christian faith, is that our physical bodies mean something, even in an eternal sense. which includes our sexual orientations,
Right.
which includes our gender identities, that these things are part of who we are as human beings. And those things are being, even my gayness is being redeemed by Jesus Christ, and not being condemned.
Right.
I can still sin by being a gay person, and I do it on a regular basis, to which I appeal to the forgiveness of God. I have come to the conclusion and realization that my sexual orientation is not what makes me a sinner.
I think, and I'm not sure where I've heard this point being made, but I think one way people view sin is that it's rebellion against God's natural order. And I think people would have made the argument that there's a way God created things to be, there's like a natural order. I guess that's mainly used to justify the belief that God ordered, men and women to be together, not men and other men, or like whatever. And that people who believe that view rebellion against that natural order as sin. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, again, that kind of is related to certain readings of the Bible as to what is considered to be natural or unnatural. If you take a real biblical view as to how did God create these things, we shouldn't have carnivores. Or if you eat meat, that's unnatural. There was no eating meat before the fall. There's a lot of things that are unnatural that are even part of the redemption of the world in Christ. Resurrection is not natural. It is supernatural. It is extra natural. And so I think this notion of what is natural is problematic, especially if you're going to try to manipulate what natural means just from one reading of part, maybe not a full reading of the biblical tradition, if you're just going to go with the biblical worldview. But looking with science, we also look around the world and see that, coming back to sexuality, that there's homosexual behavior expressed in hundreds of species. As Christians don't believe that animals sin. They don't have a soul in the sense that humans do. And so they're unable to sin, and yet somehow they are acting not sinfully because they can't sin. So they must therefore be acting in the natural way that God created them to be. And yet we still observe it there. So I think just from that perspective, my reason dictates that notion of what is natural is not the truth.
That's a good point. A reason evangelicals, or like a lot of people would give against what you said about homosexuality is that Christ commands us to deny ourselves and like take up a cross. I think a lot of people would lump in like homosexuality into that, as that is a part of ourselves that we should deny, and in order to take up Christ. What's your response to that? What are your thoughts on that? Because I'm sure you've heard that before.
Sure, yeah. Well, one, I would like to go back to Scripture and study what Jesus meant by that. Take up your cross and deny yourself. And then how has that been interpreted in not just to homosexual people, but more broadly? And why do we answer that question in a certain way for homosexual people and maybe differently for other people? To straight people, maybe you should deny your straightness and become celibate. Paul actually has an argument for that. He said that you should be celibate, but for the weakness of your sexuality, some should be married. Same for gay people. Some have the strength to be celibate, and some need to be married because that will sustain them in their life of Christ. So I think that you need to be fair in your assessment of what people should or should not be denying in themselves, and not just pinning it on a certain group because of an opinion.
So one thing when I came to the Episcopal Church was that if we're gonna have like kind of a line, right? Just imagine like a spectrum, whatever, of like liberal and conservative. People would place the Episcopal Church as like theologically like traditional kind of conservative, right? But then they like politically place it more like liberal and like because it does like support a lot of like liberal, what people would consider liberal ideology. And that's always been like a really interesting like thing in my opinion. So why do you think that is maybe my question. I don't know. Like
I have some feelings about that as well.
Yeah.
I think that I agree that the Episcopal Church is a traditional, in many ways, very conservative expression of Christianity. But when we get to, I guess, hot button issues, we are tempted to place them into partisan politics. And I want to differentiate partisan politics from politics general. General politics is we all live in society. We all live in the real world. We have real relationships with shared human beings. Who is my neighbor? That is a network of relationships that we call society. We are a part of that. We are political. We are political people just in the inherent relationships we have with the world. That's politics general. Partisan politics are aligning with a particular political party. So in the US, usually it's Democrat, Republican. There are some smaller ones, right? Which have their own platforms. They have their own stated platforms, which change over time. To immediately make the connection between how the church or how Christians engage in the world and aligning them on what a particular political party's platform, I think is problematic. Because we may not, like, for example, generally, LGBT rights and justice have aligned more in the last 30 years, at least, more with the Democratic Party's platform.
Right.
But take another issue, which I find very personally important. How are my immigrant neighbors being treated? And you look at the Democrat Party's platform track record, they are pretty poor. They have a pretty poor track record. Another conservative church that would also agree with me would be the Roman Catholic Church and their stance and their advocacy for immigrants in the United States. So I think that it's problematic just to lump a Christian worldview with a particular political party, and that goes both ways.
Yeah.
I mean, I think even like evangelicals being lumped into MAGA, the MAGA version of the Republican Party is also problematic because it's not universally true. There's a diversity of thought within that, and there's a diversity of how we engage in these things. And so to align ourselves based on our religious convictions on a political party, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the American context.
Yeah, I do think that is a big issue. I feel like there's this sense among evangelicals that politics and faith are like really intertwined, and some might say that faith is being defined by politics. I feel like there's a lot of like
Well, I think it is, and
Yeah.
I think it's so much of a problem is that once you go there and you are really invested in that, politics then becomes an idol. It becomes idolatry because you are bending your worth, what you are giving worth, to a political party's ideals and platform rather than to God.
Right.
Why are you doing it? Is it because you are following the political norm, or is your faith actually dictating and, your actions because of your formation in your relationship with God?
Yeah.
Those are two very different things, and one is idolatry, and one is actual worship of God.
Yeah, and I guess one of the big questions I had was, why do you think that?
And by the way, that goes both ways.
Right.
It can be idolatrous on both sides. I'm
Right.
not accusing one side or the other. This is you can go both ways and find idolatry on both sides. So
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. I think politics is definitely. I feel like if you really look at like a lot of evangelical beliefs, in studying like civics, whatever, and like the origins of the American system of government, I think you can see a lot of like individualism, a lot of emphasis on the founding beliefs of America, and I think like it's really interesting to see how much American politics, the American system of government, shares with modern evangelicals, and I think a lot, like, both have really influenced each other.
Sure.
Many would point that out as an issue. But one question I had was, why do you think, going back to denominations now, why do you think mainline Protestantism specifically is being so divided by the issue of LGBTQ inclusion? Like, why do we not see this issue being a bigger deal in like Baptist churches, and even in the Roman Catholic Church? Like, there is, don't get me wrong, there is division within the Catholic Church,
and in the Baptist Church as well.
right? But it's not as big of a deal, if you know what I mean.
Well, I think in
At
those
least publicly,
perhaps in those, I would say Southern Baptist,
right?
because there are multiple Baptist churches, and many of them are LGBT affirming. That's its own world. I think specifically the Southern Baptists have been actively engaged in something, coming back to your question, as being connected to Jerry Falwell and the rise of the religious right. And if you look at even Southern Baptist platform stances, if we're going to take this kind of political stances, there was a much bigger diversity of thought around sexuality and another big hot button issue, abortion, that was pushed by the religious right to control American politics by use of religion. Going back to the Roman Catholic Church, many of the stances of pro-life within the Roman Catholic Church, I think, in an American context, were also usurped by this religious right. You see this also connected to their stance on immigrants, a pro-life, not just birth life, but birth to grave life, pro-life stance within the Roman Catholic Church that has expressed itself in other ways.
Yeah.
But to come back to your question, is like I think there's a real relationship in the last 50 years between the rise of the religious right and its effects, especially on evangelicalism, and this kind of notion that there is a direct connection between our practice of religion and a particular political party. And again, I think that is at least flirting with idolatry.
Yeah. So going back, can you explain what exactly you mean by like the religious right? Like how are you defining that? Like what is that?
Going back to really the 1970s and onward with the rise of the religious right, the teachings of Jerry Falwell and other folks like him that formed organizations that were that's supported particular political campaigns, including Ronald Reagan and other prominent leaders in especially the Republican Party, that supported a certain worldview. And a lot of that worldview is Zionist in nature. So with the establishment of the State of Israel, and these certain interpretation of the scriptures that would render the maybe we're ushering in the second coming of Christ. There were these kind of maybe not fully stated in the public arena as to what their motivations were, but they were pretty clear as to what their beliefs were and kind of the reason behind their backing certain kind of politics. That they might manifest this in or remake America in their own kind of perspective of what their religion, their interpretation of their religion should be. Starting in the 70s and really pushing to today.
Yeah. So what do you think that the problem is with this like mix of faith and politics? Because like, I think I would agree. I think a lot of people would agree that, and especially throughout the history of Christianity, that the church and faith has played a big role in politics. Like going back to what I said, the church has been a big force. It was a big force in the abolition movement. It was a big force in starting orphanages and in hospitals and in banning the gladiatorial games and like stuff like that in Rome. The church has played a big role in what a lot of people would consider politics, right? But we're seeing this new movement, especially in evangelical churches and especially in like the Republican Party, of this like mix of politics and faith. But it's kind of different than what we've seen throughout most of Christianity, at least I think. So what's the issues with that? Why is this involvement in politics different? Why is it, I don't want to say bad, but like why is this different? Why could it be an issue?
It's an interesting question. I don't know that I fully have an answer for that, but where I would go with it is part of being a human is being involved with your society.
Right.
And you're going to bring your full worldview and your opinions and your experience to bear full bore on that. So that's nothing new. And Christians' involvement in politics is nothing new. I mean, Jesus himself was crucified by the empire. There's a political reality in the crucifixion, right? Where we get into trouble is equating our worship of God as being the same as our partisan politics. I mean, you can say that America is a Christian nation, but which Christianity are you talking about? And that's where it comes, this is my own maybe political views, partisan political views or whatever, is that the importance of our democracy is crucial in balancing out a variety of opinions. And when that is being directly attacked as not hearing the full voice of the people, that is where we run into trouble. Is where we see a certain worldview being pushed on the rest of the populace. That is not, I think, what the founders of our country had in mind. But that there would be a full voice of the people represented in our government. When that is being manipulated, which we've seen in multiple different ways, is both parties have done it, gerrymandering and you name it, some voter suppression. That is where you find certain worldviews being highlighted over others. They might be often, as we were just talking with the religious right, that particular religious worldview being hoisted upon the rest of the populace, and I think that's problematic.
Yeah.
It's unhealthy and it's undemocratic.
I think another thing too is I think a lot of people would say that the Episcopal Church, especially, because it is involved a lot in what's going on with immigration. It's involved a lot with the LGBTQ movement. It's involved in a lot of what people would consider like liberal-leaning movements. And I think it's one question I'd have, like, since we're discussing like faith and politics right now, and we're kind of also focusing on the evangelical right, is to kind of talk about how the Episcopal Church has gotten involved in politics and how that is. Okay, I'd assume you believe that that's a good thing, right?
So I mean, I think so. The Episcopal Church, yes, there is like public policy, and there is a network of doing that, and it's based on what the General Convention, which is our governing body, which is a democratic institution. What we have voiced are the official stances of the church, and then we lobby to our representatives in Congress. That is an active role within the political system. It is not a manipulation of the political system. It is an advocacy of a certain worldview, what we think is right policy. But it is not a manipulation. It is an expression, official expressions of what we as a body have expressed as concerning, what we think needs to change in the world, what we want to see happen in the world. And we lobby our representatives to do that. That is the nature of the democratic process. What is not democratic is undermining who those representatives are, buying them off, otherwise incentivizing our representatives, which undermines the whole democracy itself. Those are two very different things. So being involved with the political process and manipulating the political process, that's the difference where I think, and like every church has a political wing, an advocacy wing, which they should be doing. And it's not just lobbying our representatives, it's being involved with the communities that in which we live. Whether that's advocating for our immigrants, it might be advocating for homeless folks, it might be advocating for LGBT rights, you name it. The church is involved with the world. This is how we live. Some of that is done institutionally, some of that's done on a diocesan or regional level, some of that's done on individual levels. And so I think there's a different way of understanding our political engagement as being separate from that of political manipulation.
Yeah. Right now, the Episcopal Church is kind of split between the Episcopal Church and what people would consider the more conservative, like ACNA. Okay. How do you think the conflict between the two resolves? Do you think that the two will ever reunite?
I don't know the answer to that. I have my prayers for it, and I think the ACNA formed out of folks leaving the Episcopal Church, and it wasn't just over LGBT issues. There have been groups of Episcopalians who've broken off for decades. One, I mentioned earlier, women in ministry, prayer book, various political things, various theologies. I mean, there's a Calvinist, super Calvinist wing, a Reformed wing of Anglicanism as well. It's part of our history. So there are multiple groups that coalesced into the ACNA, and there are some groups that never made it back, that did not come into the ACNA. The latest split was over LGBT issues, but there were ones before that. Right. So I wanted to kind of state that as well. I think with the Episcopalians and the ACNA that we're each other's closest relatives in the church. We share the same DNA. We basically share the same prayer book. I know the ACNA has a new prayer book, but it's the same structure, ultimately, of the historic prayer books that have been part of our tradition. I don't know if we can reconcile, at least as denominations. I think that we can reconcile individually on individual relationships, and honestly probably need to start making more concerted efforts toward that. A lot of the first generation are still around,
Right.
and so there's a lot of honestly just personal relationships that were broken. I think as the years go, because it's only been 10, 15 years since that happened.
Really recent.
The folks who are coming in never had that relationship with the Episcopal Church. So they didn't leave the Episcopal Church. They have joined the ACNA, either born into it or they joined it from other denominations.
Right.
I think as time goes on and there's a more of an identity as the ACNA, as we've always been ACNA, and I didn't have a previous relationship with the Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
I think those personal relationships will be easier to come by and resolve. And I think as the political environment changes, these issues will become less of an issue, right? And I think over time there may be some potential for reconciliation in that. Throughout the 20th century, there's been something called the liturgical renewal, in which many bodies within Christianity broadly have begun dialogues with one another that did not exist before the 20th century. There was a break, and we didn't really have a real relationship with you officially as an entity. And so there's ongoing Anglican Roman Catholic dialogues, Anglican Orthodox, Anglican Lutheran. And some of these have made real inroads to coming back together. How do we restore communion? This ministry is a example of what a possible, we are the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the ELCA, and the Episcopal Church did not merge as denominations.
Right.
But we did come together as full communion partners and recognizing that the full validity of each other's ministry and orders of ministry, sacraments. And so the ministries like this that are fully shared, and I walk between worlds fully. I think that's the kind of relationship that we may be able to restore with the ACNA at some point.
Yeah.
And I hope that will. But as the ACNA will continue to grow as a body, they're going to develop their own charisms, their own expression of what it means to be Anglican. We may not agree with everything, but I think we may find that we agree on way more than we have differences about. And we may be able to get over those differences in order to have a more reconciled relationship with one another.
Yeah.
I don't know what the time frame of that is. It may be past my lifetime.
Yeah.
But I think that's some of the hope that we have in Christ, is that we really are one body. We believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And ultimately those things will be reconciled in Christ.
Right. I think going back to the discussion on faith and politics, what should Christians' relationship be with politics? Like, what should our relationship be between faith and politics?
Well, as Christians, that falls first on our identity as disciples of Jesus and our serious engagement of being the students of Jesus. How are we being formed into the likeness of Christ? How does my life resemble that of Jesus? The harder you lean into that and honestly have that conversation will affect the way that you live in the world, and thus your politics. Is there a diversity within that? I think there probably is. But ultimately, I think the harder and more fully you are aligned with the person of Jesus, honestly engaging in the gospel and his teachings, and how does that affect the way that I am formed, the way that I live as a Christian, that ultimately is the way that we engage in politics. Mm-hmm. Again, there's going to be a diversity of how that happens, just because we are all individuals and we all have our own individual relationships in the world. But as disciples of Christ, if we are going to be disciples of Christ, that identity has to come first.
Right. One last final question, right, to kind of wrap everything up. What is your case for why someone should be Episcopalian?
Well, because we're the best. Okay.
Obviously.
My case comes out of my own experience. And my own experience has been a place where I have been allowed to explore what it means to be a disciple of Christ in my own person, and discover who Jesus is in ways that, with questions that I was discouraged from asking growing up. So I found it a place to ask the hard questions and to wrestle with those questions and to have a community to do that in. I don't think the Episcopal Church is the only place you can do that. And so I am a ecumenist, meaning that I think that I believe in the fullness of the body of Christ is expressed in the totality of the church. Now, the Episcopal Church is not the totality of the church. It is one part it is a member of the church.
Right.
But it is a part of the church in which I have been welcomed. I know that it's a part of the church that many people will can find a home in, and where they will be welcomed. It has tended to be a place where many folks who, for whatever reason, did not find a welcome in other parts of the church, to be a place where they can be themselves. They can ask those hard questions, and they can find community to do that with. And so, again, asking those hard questions has appealed to my intellectual side. It has been a place where I have dived in deep academically in studying the history of the church and the history of our faith and the Bible, and in which I can engage not only just my own whimsy, but engage my brain, engage the studies to not just make an academic study of it, but how does that academic study affect the way that I live as a disciple of Jesus? And I found it a home that I've been able to do that well in.
Do you have anything else you want to talk about? You want to say?
I don't know. I'm interested to hear your take on it.
On why?
On our conversation.
Yeah, no, this has definitely been a learning experience. I don't know why. Usually whenever I do interviews, I think this is the first big long-form discussion interview I've ever done. Usually whenever I'm doing interviews, it's like I ask a question and then like whatever your response is going to be, it's going to go into the Beacon or whatever. It's like newspaper right for.
Oh, sure.
And so I'm very used to like one-sided, like I'm just going to ask you a question, I get an answer, and like that's it. I think that's definitely something to get used to with like podcast interviewing. You know, like I'm actually expected to like participate a little bit, right. And it definitely caught me off guard, especially when asking questions, because I was like, I don't know, maybe next time I need to like get a piece of paper and like write down my questions, because I was definitely thinking a lot about like what you were saying, but like I completely forgot when like you stopped talking, and I was like, oh, I gotta ask a question now. So, I think, I tried to give my my opinions whenever, especially when we were going over faith and politics, because I think that is something that is kind of an issue, especially with evangelicals. I don't hate them. I like grew up evangelical, but I feel like that there's this like fanaticism of like politics within a lot of evangelical circles that I think is an issue. But also, whenever I became Episcopalian and learning more about that and like mainline Protestantism, another issue I had was with the more like liberal activist part of the church. I mean, a lot of it was because I kind of disagree with those politics. I personally lean more conservative. And so that an issue there was, I mean, obviously, like the political differences.
And I would say within the Episcopal Church, there is a spectrum of that exists. I mean, even after the split with the ACNA, that there is a very strong conservative wing in the Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
There is a diversity of thought on many issues.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's like, yes, we did split over an issue, but there's
a lot of
lot, there's a breadth. There's no monolithic thought in the Episcopal Church by any stretch of the imagination.
I definitely do like that part of it.
Yeah.
What I believe is like the fanaticism of a lot of like Republicans in evangelical wings, and it's not to like diminish them in any way. I just like I don't personally support the fanaticism, even though I do support politics, if that makes sense. I mean,
we're multifaceted people.
Yeah.
We have like you can't box people into like you have to conform to this. Like that's never worked. It doesn't work for you. It doesn't work for me. It doesn't work for anybody.
And in America today, we're very divided on if you believe this, you also believe all of these. Like it's very like our beliefs are very blocked in. Like if you're Republican, you're a Christian, or if you're a Christian, you're a Republican. You believe like pro-life, anti-gay, blah, 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 like stuff about immigration. Like you're very boxed into your beliefs depending on like where you are. And I definitely, I'm way more, even though like personally deep down, a lot of people, if they really knew like what I believed in, I guess, would probably consider me like really conservative. But also, like I'm personally convicted to be like to believe in what I believe in and a lot of my conservative beliefs, but also I'm far more open to a lot of like liberal beliefs than a lot of other conservatives would be. Like I'm very like open-minded about it. It's like a reason why we're having this conversation.
Right, yeah.
I was really interested in learning more about like where you guys are coming from and like where that belief stems from. I'm definitely, I feel like I'm way more open to other people's beliefs. And you definitely like, I don't want to say change my mind, but I definitely like really, I can see now like where you're coming from. You definitely challenged my viewpoint in a lot of ways. I do appreciate that. I really like that. Because now I have to like kind of wrestle with, now where do I stand about this issue?
We do that for each other. I'm like, that's part of, I think that's part of the Christian faith is that what is it, iron sharpens iron. And I think an important part of being a Christian is to have the humility to say that I don't know everything. And I am continuing to learn and I'm continuing to be, as part of our discipleship. If you're going to be a disciple, it means you're going to be a student. And a student is one who's learning.
Right. So
I don't have everything figured out either.
Yeah. And I think my main, I guess a big part of who I am and my personality and what I hope to accomplish with this interview specifically and with like a lot of interviews I'm hoping to get done in the future is to like share more viewpoints. Because that was another reason why I became Episcopalian was I've always been wanting to learn more about what other people believe. Because I personally believe that if somebody else holds this belief, then there's enough credibility somewhere, somehow, for this belief. And I remember when because I grew up evangelical Baptist, right? I definitely struggled with believing in God. Like, I was agnostic for a long time, mainly because of like the emotionalism you see in a lot of evangelical churches. And it was learning more about Catholicism, actually, that brought me into learning about what historic Christianity was.
Sure, yeah.
Like, growing up evangelical Baptist, you hear a lot about Catholics and about how they're not like Christian or what they do is like wrong. And it was really when I started grappling with like, so why do Catholics believe ... And that was what really brought me into like the Anglican Church. Like, there's also a bunch of like personal reasons. Like, we have Anglican priests that are like really involved in my high school, and so like that was really an obvious bridge. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that was definitely a big part in having that connection. But like on a intellectual level, on like a non-personal level, the disposition to explore other ideas in their like fullness and not diminish other ideas is definitely something I want to accomplish with conversations like this, with like future interviews with, hopefully with Muslims, with Buddhists, Hindus. That's hopefully what I'm hoping to get out of this series.
Yeah, I hope so too.
But yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation.
You too. That's great.
Maybe we gotta do another follow up once I actually like figure out what questions I want to push back on, and maybe we can do another clip. But yeah,
sounds good.
Thank you for coming out today.
All right, sir.
Heck yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Good grief.